In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judea, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Amalek. There we go, we can work it out together. Aren't we clever? His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Yep, no one's correcting me. How about that? They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judea, and they went to Moab and they lived there. Now Amalek and Naomi's husband died, and she was left with 2 sons. They married Moabite women. One was named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion had also died. Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband.
That's better. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, and as you have shown kindness to your dead husband to me, may the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband."
Then she kissed them goodbye. They wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband." Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them?
No, my daughters, it would be more bitter for me than you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. And this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you will go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and I." Then Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her. She stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. May the Lord bless that reading. Thank you, girls. Thank you.
I wonder this morning what you know about your ancestors. Do you know some family stories from 3, 4, even 5 generations back? What do you know of the people that came before you? This morning we'll be looking at the story of Ruth, which is a story of the ancestors of King David. Here's some of my ancestors. It's an old photograph from a newspaper in the late 1920s. The babe in arms is my father, and the man holding him is my great-great-grandfather, Augustus Wilhelm Friedrich Krause. My forebears came out to Australia in the 1860s. They lived in Prussia, and at that time, under Otto von Bismarck, there was a lot of warring going on in the Germanic states. Bismarck was busily trying to unite Germany. And in the midst of all that war, there was severe taxes and crushing poverty, particularly for those who didn't own any land, like my great-great-grandfather. They sold everything they had and bought passage out to Australia, landing here, as I said, in the 1860s. His eldest son, Carl, was 18 at the time, and his first job was working on a cane farm just north of Brisbane in a place called Caboolture. He earned £15 a year. That's $30. And even with inflation, it's only $2,500. Some years later, he went north to the Mary River goldfields. Most of the alluvial gold had been gone by then. And so Carl walked up a hill, staked out a claim, and started digging a mine shaft. Reportedly the first mine shaft in the Gympie goldfields. After a few weeks, he took his pay dirt down to the river to wash it out, and he found some gold. The family legend is that by the time he got back up the top of that hill, the whole of the hill had been staked out by other people making claims. And that hill is where the town of Gympie is today. Now, after 6 months, he'd amassed a fortune of £150, $300. Remember, that's 10 times what he earned in his first job. He thought he was set for life. So he returned to Brisbane. He spent half of that money buying land and building a house for his parents. What a nice bloke. And the rest of it he put into a business, but his business partner ripped him off and he became penniless and a swagman for a while. Much later, the family moved to the town of Marburg, west of Brisbane, between Brisbane and Toowoomba, and that's where August and Carl are buried today. They were economic refugees from Russia who sailed halfway around the world to make a life for themselves here in Australia. But enough about my family. Today we're going to be talking about this book of Ruth. And if the baby in this photo was King David, the man holding him would be Boaz. So let's go back in time, not 150 years ago, but over 3,000 years ago, to the time of the Judges. Let's put that into some context for us. Here's a brief outline down the left-hand column of biblical history, human history as it's explained in the Bible. We start off with creation and the fall and the flood and the Tower of Babel, where the nations were scattered in different languages. And then we have the story of the patriarchs and Egypt. We come back from Egypt, wandering in the desert, and enter the land with Joshua leading. And there's a time of the Judges before King Saul and King David and King Solomon in the United Kingdom. And then we have a divided kingdom, the Exodus into Babylon, and so it goes on. This story takes place in the time of the Judges. And I have to say that the story of Ruth has a particular female focus. The main characters are female, and it's an unusual story in that regard in the midst of a very patriarchal setting. There's a reference back not so much to the patriarchs but to the wives, Rachel and Leah, and this woman called Tamar. Now, the story of Tamar is a really awful and ugly story, and it falls to Chris in a few weeks' time to explain why the reference to Tamar is here. But just to give you one clue, because it relates to the story of Ruth as well. The story of Tamar, and to some extent the story of Ruth, is about female initiative in the midst of male inaction, whether that's through obstinance or blindness or hesitancy. Both stories have a common thread of female initiative in the midst of male inaction. So I'll come back to some more general comments about the whole book of Ruth in a moment, but I think for now I'd like to dive into the story. Verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled. What does that mean? Well, I've just put it into context in the flow of history, but what does it actually mean? Why is that important to us? The verse immediately before this verse, the last verse in the book of Judges, sums up that period of time in this way. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. The NRSV says everyone did what was right in their own eyes, what they considered to be right for them. It was a time of relative truth. You live your life your way and I'll live my life my way. Does that sound a bit like today? So the time of the judges over 3,000 years ago has something in common with today. But the story goes on. There was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Now, we're not told why this family was particularly impacted by this famine more than anyone else around them. Obviously, some people stayed in the land, but Elimelech chose to take his family to Moab. It wasn't around the other side of the world. It was only the next door country, probably about a 7-day walk to get there. But it may as well have been a foreign land, far away, because it was very different to the land of Israel where he was living. He was an economic refugee that moved to Moab. This man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Verse 3. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons or her husband. Now, it's bad enough to be a widow in those days. But initially, when husband died, she had 2 sons that were able to support her. But now her 2 sons also have died. We have a situation here where we have 3 childless widows with no means of support. But the other thing I want to point out to you is the 10 years that's mentioned there. This is a clue that in those 10 years of marriage, Ruth was childless. It's a significant piece of information. 10 years was the traditional amount of time that a wife would wait, and it was the time that Sarah waited before she offered her handmaiden Hagar to Abraham. So that 10 years is perhaps a clue to their situation. But moving on then to verse 6. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughter-in-laws prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. So as I said before, they had absolutely no prospects in this foreign land. As widows, life was going to be really tough, and particularly as Jewish widows in a foreign land. So they thought, better to return back. Naomi thought, well, at least there'll be some people I know. I might get a little bit of charity. There's a rudimentary welfare system in place in Israel. Maybe I should go home. I've got nothing to stay here for. And so then, Naomi said to her two daughter-in-laws, I'm sorry. Yes. Then Naomi said to her two daughter-in-laws, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." And then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, and they said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." This is the first of three pleas on behalf of Naomi to urge her two daughters-in-law to go back. And she puts it on the basis of they've got a more secure future if they go back and stay in Moab than going with her, because then they'll be in what to them will be a foreign land. Can you imagine it? Three women wailing and weeping on the side of the road, all distraught, not knowing what to do, indecisive about going on or going back. And so there's this scene of these three women on the side of the road. And they said they'd go on with her, but Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? I'm not going to be the source of you having a future and a life. Return home. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope, even if I had a husband tonight and gave birth to sons, would you wait till they grew up? Would you remain unmarried? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." So this is Naomi's second appeal to her two daughter-in-laws to go back. It seems to me that she's motivated purely by love for these two girls, these two women. It's not selfish on her part. She'd be glad of the company. But it's serving their interests if they go back. They've got more chance of having a better future. And so verse 14, "At this they wept aloud again." There they are, wailing on the side of the road. "And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her." So Orpah turns back. Ruth's still there. Naomi tries one more time, using a bit of peer pressure. "Look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." And now we have this astonishing speech from Ruth. It's the first time Ruth speaks in our passage. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates me from you." I'm sure that's a passage that you're familiar with. It's certainly a well-known and astonishing response from Ruth in the context that she finds herself in. She's expressing total and utter loyalty both to Naomi, her mother-in-law, but also to the God of Israel, Yahweh. We'll come back to that later on. When Naomi realised that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. And so the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. Perhaps they chatted along the way, but the Bible doesn't say that. They went on in silence, perhaps. And then they arrive at Bethlehem, and there's a bit of a commotion. When they arrived there, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi? We haven't seen her for 10 years. "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." And so that's the setup for the story of Ruth. Not a lot has happened in this chapter. All the really good stuff happens in the next 3 chapters, which Karen and Lynn and Chris are going to unpack for us. I wanted to mention, though, the names of these characters, because names in the Bible often have a special significance. Names represent both someone's character and in some ways their destiny. Elimelech's name means God is my king. Mahlon is unhealthy or to blot out, and Chilion means puny or to perish. Now, why you'd name your kid that, I don't know. But that seems to be their destiny in the story and the part they played in this drama. Orpah means a fawn, in some sense a stiff-necked. Now, she did stick with her mother-in-law for a while and only left when she was persuaded to. So I think her name's a bit harsh there. I don't see her as being a bad character here. But Ruth's name means desirable. Desirable in a pleasant way, as in a friend or a neighbour. Someone who you want in your life because they build up your emotional stores, not drain you. Boaz's name means strength or power. Naomi's name means pleasant in the way that you describe a land. But she renames herself as Mara, which, as the text says, means bitter. So they're the characters that we're going to see in this drama. Most of them we've seen already. And so the chapter concludes with this summary verse. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. That's the setup. We're ready for the really remarkable story now of Ruth. A story of kindness, a story of devotion, of duty, of decency and decorum, of doing things the proper way. The book of Ruth is not just a charming story of commitment, courage and cleverness. It's a human drama that's played out, a classic drama from tragedy to triumph. We start in this chapter with famine and migration and death and childlessness. All of those elements we've seen in chapter 1 of Ruth. And we see over the course of this story the forming of Ruth. Did you notice when they got to Bethlehem in that paragraph, Ruth's name wasn't even mentioned. Ruth was a nobody. This strange foreigner that was accompanying Naomi. In the next chapter, Ruth is described as a loyal companion. In chapter 3, she's noticeable. She's even described as desirable, a pleasant woman. In chapter 4, she's described as a woman. She becomes a wife and becomes a mother. And at the end of the story, we find out she's the great-grandmother of King David. So it's a story of Ruth and her growth and development. It's a story of ordinary people in tough and trying circumstances. Do you remember the last time I was here 3 weeks ago? We talked about seeing your circumstances through God's eyes, having a godly view of circumstances. So here's a bunch of ordinary people in some really tough times. I wonder if we can see how they view their circumstances, if they're seeing God in what's happening to them in this story. Some people think that the book of Ruth, God is absent. We don't see God directly in this story. And I guess that's true. We don't see any angels or divine dialogue. There's no prophecies per se, no miracles. Or is there? If we take the time to look carefully at this story, there's at least 2 miracles. The famine in Israel is broken. God provides food for his people once again. That's a miracle. And later on, the conception of Ruth giving birth, is perhaps a miracle if we understand correctly that she was barren initially. But the thing about Ruth is that we see God at work in the everyday. God is throughout this story, if we just take the time to look. His purposes are in play constantly in this story. He rescues Elimelech's family's line and provides an heir. He grafts in yet another Gentile person into his kingdom. And he sets up the line of David and, according to Matthew's Gospel, the line of Jesus. In the next chapter, in verse 3 of chapter 2, we're told that Naomi just happened by chance to glean in the field of Boaz. Is that by chance? Or do we see God's hand in that as well, God directing what happens? You see, God remains in view, I think, throughout this story. He's acknowledged. 18 times the word Yahweh appears in the text. Now, in your NIV translation, that will appear as the word Lord in all capitals. So where you see Lord, not just with an initial capital, but all caps in the NIV, that means Yahweh. That's the covenantal name of God that Israel used to refer to God. And another 2 times, God is referred to as Shaddai, translated in the NIV as the Almighty. So God's name is mentioned 20 times. We also see that God is being obeyed. His commandments are being followed. But most of all, we see God's character being demonstrated in human lives, human action, in the hesed, the loving kindness that is shown, the faithfulness that's demonstrated, the integrity and the devotion that takes place. That's people showing God to one another. There's 2 really important Hebrew words that I'd like you to learn this morning because they pop up in Ruth. Oh, don't tell me. I put an extra slide in this morning and it didn't make it to church. I'll have to explain it to you this way. The first word is hesed, H-E-S-E-D in English. Hesed is often translated, when we refer to God's hesed, as loving kindness, God's loving kindness to his people. In the context of the story of Ruth, the people that demonstrate hesed, some commentators prefer to translate it as loyal love, but the same idea is there. Hesed is kindness and loyal love that's shown by God to us and by us to others. Hesed crops up in chapter 1 in reference to God, in chapter 2 in reference to Boaz, and in chapter 3 in reference to Ruth. The second word is the word Hayel, H-A-Y-I-L in English. Hayel is a Hebrew word that has a wide range of meanings. And it can mean power, strength, riches, influence. But in the book of Ruth, it generally means strength of character or integrity. The word Hayel is used in chapter 2 to refer to Boaz, where it's often translated as wealthy. It's used in chapter 3 to talk of Ruth, where it's sometimes translated virtuous. And it's also used in chapter 4 in a blessing over Ruth and Boaz's marriage. The point about Hesed and Hayel in the book of Ruth, though, is that they're not just a thought or an intention, but they're actually lived out. They're demonstrated in people's actions, what they do. And so the point is that when people of faith practice hesed towards one another and to outsiders, we do so in the strength of God's Spirit working within us. God active and God acting through our actions and behaviours as we express hesed, loving kindness to one another and to outsiders. I was in Perth recently, I mentioned that last time, and my son's church, Life Streams Christian Church in southern Perth, We're doing a series on Ruth, and the thing that stood out to me the most, though, was they did their Bible readings in the local Aboriginal tongue, the Nuingal language. And the Bible had been translated into this language, or some of the Bible, I should say. The first book translated, I think, was the Gospel of Mark, but the second book they translated was Ruth. Why would Ruth be the second priority for translating into the native language? Because it resonates with that culture. It's a story about women separated from their tribe, coming back into family, being reconnected. And so the book of Ruth's been translated into this local language, and the Bible readings were read out in Aboriginal tongue, which made no sense to me at all. But alongside that is the English translation of the Aboriginal. So it's been translated into Aboriginal and then put back into modern English for those Aboriginals who don't have as much of their native tongue as possible. And the thing that stood out to me is the description of Boaz here. Ruth calls him my right way man. So in these cultures, there's laws and rules and rituals, and there's a right way to do things and there's a wrong way to do things. There's the right kind of people to mix with and have relations with, and there's the wrong people to have relations with. And for Ruth, Boaz was her right way man. He was a person that she should associate with. But also he did things the right way. He was a good man. So I just found that interesting. I thought I'd share that with you this morning. Let's get back to the idea of Hesed. Doing Hesed properly, doing it well, it's risky. It makes you vulnerable to people. It's restrictive if you do it well and do it properly. It takes resources, particularly time, to invest in others. If you want to do it properly, you don't just do a little bit of a help. You really want to make a difference to people's lives. You do things the proper way. You don't take shortcuts. Notice in the story of Ruth, as we go through the next few weeks, that Ruth asks permission to glean. She's got the right to be there as an impoverished person to go into the fields and pick up the leftovers, but she asks the foreman permission to do so. She follows the instructions of her mentor. Who's her mentor? Her mother-in-law. How many of you listen to your mother-in-laws and follow their instructions to the letter? Ruth does. She's a right way woman. And Boaz goes out of his way to do things the right way, to be in touch with and negotiate with the closer relative. So as I said before, the source of Hesed is God. God himself is Hesed. God is love. But God also honours Hesed in us. And God answers prayers. As you go through the book of Ruth in the next few weeks, watch out for the prayers and whether or not they're answered in the book of Ruth. Yahweh is called on to bestow blessings. Naomi says this over her two daughters-in-law on the road out of Moab. The workers and Boaz greet each other with a blessing, invoking the name of Yahweh. Naomi again uses Yahweh's name in a blessing in chapter 2, and Boaz in chapter 3, and the elders in chapter 4. And both Ruth and Boaz invoke Yahweh's name in uttering oaths. We saw Ruth this morning, and we'll see Boaz in chapter 3. So let's have a look at this declaration. This is the highlight of this chapter, I think, for most of us would agree with that. Why is that cut off? Ruth's declaration shows a commitment, as I said, to her mother-in-law and to God. How did this occur? How did this extraordinary statement come about? What's going on here? Well, we know that Ruth lived in her Jewish family's home for 10 years in Moab. Can we assume that they were faithful Jewish worshippers in that time? That Ruth effectively became a Jew in her customs and practice and worldview? Maybe. I wonder if someone stayed in your house for a year, how much influence you'd have on them. Or you took in a boarder for a couple of years. I wonder how much influence you have on your neighbours, who you lived next to for 10 years or 20 years. Has your life made a difference to them? Because it seems to me that Ruth's life was greatly impacted by the 10 years that she was married to Killian. These are the first words we hear from Ruth, and they're very poetic. I've laid them out in this way to show the poetry of the verses. There's some very carefully chosen words here which express exactly the opposite of what Naomi is asking her to do and of the path that Orpah has chosen. And she starts off with a command. She says to her mother-in-law, "Do not pressure me." She says, "Stop urging me to turn back." And this word "turn back" is slightly different from what Naomi was doing. Naomi was saying, "Turn back from going with me to your familiar country." Ruth's saying, "Don't force me to turn back to there. I want to go this way." So although it's the same word, there's some differences in the way it's expressed, but we won't get into that. Basically, she says, "I'm sticking with you, come what may. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, where you lodge, where your dwelling place is, will be my dwelling place." And then she goes one step further than what she really needs to. She says, "Your people and your God will be my people and my God. I reject my background. I reject my former way of life. I reject my Moabiteness. I want to stick with you." It reminds me of Matthew's Gospel, where Jesus said, "Everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or fathers or mothers or wife or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life." How stuck to Jesus are you? Ruth goes even further though. Her commitment to Naomi isn't just for as long as Naomi lives. It's for the whole of her life, as well as the whole of Naomi's life. She's crossed over. Her commitment to Naomi is permanent and irrevocable. Where Naomi dies, she will die, and there she will be buried. That is an extraordinary statement for her to make. And then she seals the whole deal with an oath. Now, this oath that she declares is a classic ancient Near East format, but it's a format that's normally used by high officials, kings, princes, high priests, in swearing promises and allegiances and invoking the covenant name of Yahweh. She says, "May the Lord Yahweh deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even my death separates you from me." And it's just one example of this. King David, when he was grieving the death of his son, one of his sons in battle, said this: "They all came and urged David to eat something while he was still day. But David took an oath saying, 'May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if I taste bread or anything else before the sun sets.'" That's the same formula. Now, some commentators also see a hint of Abraham in this story. That Abraham was called to leave his country, pack up his goods and worldly possessions and move to a land he didn't know. In Ruth's declaration, she goes without the prompting of God. She makes this same statement that Abraham did, that I will leave where I grew up and I will go with you. In some ways, Ruth may have outdone even the patriarch Abraham. Abraham was told by the Lord, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to a land I will show you. So finally, then, I wanted to quote from Luke. Jesus said in Luke, no one who puts a hand to the plough and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. Ruth has made an extraordinary commitment. And so we wait to see if she can live up to that commitment in what follows. Will she live out a life that's shaped by that commitment? She was emphatic in the way she expressed her commitment. It involved a place that she was moving to. It involved a time for all time. It involved a God and involved a family. How about you? Can you live up to the commitment you've made? Are you committed to one another? Are you committed to God? Would you join me in prayer? Father God, this morning we thank you for the scriptures and for this story of Ruth. May your Spirit guide our reflections and draw out lessons for us in the weeks ahead. May you give us the strength to live lives of hesed by the power of your Spirit. We ask this morning that you would interrupt our week with thoughts of this story and opportunities to do hesed to others. May your kingdom come and may your will be done through us this week and evermore. And all God's people said, Amen.